everybody. Good afternoon, good evening for those of you that are in Europe. This is another discussion of the Wizards of Ox Live. And I am joined here tonight, like every night, with our beautiful co-wizards, Karla, Wiersma, and Monique Attinger. How are you, everybody? And today we're going to be discussing some basic supplementation because we've been talking about how this is a different diet. This is not, the low oxalate journey is something that you do slowly, and it's something that you support your metabolism with. This is not just, I'm going to remove this food and it's done. This is a different thing. This is a repair diet. This is a diet that brings everything back into balance. And so we're going to be helping our metabolism with it. And so we're going to be talking about some of the basic supplements that are recommended in a low oxalate journey. And I would love to say that I want to start changing this whole idea of a low oxalate diet, and everybody has to be low oxalate, to a lowering oxalate diet, where wherever you're starting, that's fine, as long as you slowly and in a very constant fashion start lowering your intake. So whenever you start seeing recipes, ingredients, articles, and things like that, I want all of you to be very savvy and just remember that in your particular journey, you're going to be able to add some foods or remove some foods according to what your level is. Don't follow blindly anybody. So I think that's just a really important thing. And as every day, we're going to remind you of our little warning text, which is that we are considering that you have some capable and knowledgeable medical, counsel. We are going to be sharing our experiences. We're not giving any type of specialist or medical consultation at this time. So if you're okay with that, you are most welcome to join us, and welcome everybody. Monique, do you want to get started, or Karla?
Sure, I can start if you want. So we were going to talk about basic supplements today. And we had originally talked a little bit about talking through some of the issues that people can have with B vitamins, which can be really important, especially for those of us who might have tiptoed into the endogenous oxalate production. And what that means for those of you who are not familiar with that terminology is that's when our bodies are producing the oxalate. It can happen as a response to oxidative stress and depletion of some of our B vitamins, particularly B6. And so this can make supplements a much more important feature for those of us who may be endogenous, but even for those of us who are coming to this way of eating because we've eaten too much oxalate. I was definitely just the eat too much oxalate group. What I would say is while B vitamins are very important, they may not be where you want to start. We started with minerals because so many of us have minerals depleted in our bodies because of the kinds of things that oxalate does, not the least of which we've talked about in other meetings, where your oxalate ion wants to bind with something that balances out its charge. So it's a double negative. And most of your minerals are either single or double positives. And so, as I call them, preferred dance partners include calcium, magnesium, zinc, copper, iron, all kinds of things that happen in a double positive form. And so often we are going to need those. And it can be a more gentle place to start if you start with those, especially if you're just in the process of reducing how much oxalate you're taking in. And many of those minerals are cofactors to other metabolic pathways or uses of our vitamins where we must have the mineral as part of what our body's trying to do. So that said, I'll say this, the big B vitamins, not that you shouldn't take the others, not that the others are not important, but the big three, who I tend to call the three musketeers, are biotin, B6, and B1. And so these are ones where people are more likely to see that they have need of them because of what oxalate may be doing in your body. And, you know, really the big thing here with these three is we need to start really slowly. I would recommend that people get their mineral intake as good as possible first, because things like magnesium are cofactors for all kinds of things that use B6, all kinds of things that use B1. I'm not as familiar with biotin, but nothing would surprise me in terms of it needing magnesium as well, because magnesium is used all through the body for all kinds of things. So it's really important to be able to have the nutrients that your body's going to lean into using when you bring this additional B vitamin on board. Because your body's going to be able to start to do perhaps types of work that it hasn't been doing because it hasn't had enough of certain nutrients. And so it's kind of, it has the ability to manage the work. So if you're non-urgent, you may have been waiting. But as we bring in these nutrients, then some of this work that's in the backlog can get started. And we really want to make sure you have enough nutrient for whatever the process is. And we don't always have any idea consciously what our bodies might be starting up to do. So there could be all kinds of nutrients needed in a complete pathway for something your body is trying to produce, or a pathway that it's trying to run. And so it can help to have some of our other basics on board before we get too far into the B vitamins. We didn't have as much difficulty here in terms of starting. So I might turn it over to Patricia and Karla now, who I think had a little more issue there than we did here. Because we didn't have as many health things going on, except for me. But even with me, I had a history of taking supplements for a long time, so I didn't have any problem starting to implement my Bs. But I also started out with this really methodical work away at minerals before I ever went, okay, I think I know enough to start Bs. So yeah, I'll turn it over to you two for more of the playing field.
Just two items. B1 can actually trigger a B1 deficiency, is also something that can trigger endogenous production. Not as common as B6. That tends to be the biggie that people see, and one that's more studied, but B1 can do it as well. My son was unfortunately deficient in both, and so we had to tackle both issues. The other thing with biotin, magnesium is indeed a cofactor. So if you're taking biotin and you find that you're getting constipated, you need to increase your magnesium, because it will deplete your magnesium. So I would have to agree with Monique. It's the best way is to get the minerals on board and get good levels of those before you start implementing other vitamins. We tried putting in biotin for a while, but my kid was chronically constipated. And until I got that resolved, every time I increased the biotin, the constipation got worse. So we could stay at like 100 micrograms, which was nowhere near the amount that he needed. But until we got the constipation resolved, biotin took a back seat. And, part of that was getting good magnesium levels, but it was also figuring out what's the root cause of the constipation. And for my kid, it was more bacterial. He had a pretty messed up gut. So until we got his gut issues settled, it just wasn't going to do any good.
Our story was a little bit different. We absolutely loved biotin and loved thiamine and loved B6. And once we had them in place in that order, it was like actually, I want to show you, I'm going to look for it in a little bit, the citric acid cycle, which is the Krebs cycle, the energy cycle. So we need to understand what's happening. And we've been talking about this cycle as a step-by-step process where we get into energy production, but we also get all sorts of half steps throughout the circle, so to speak. If you're missing some of the ingredients to go to the next step, then two things happen. Then you have a limiting ingredient that makes that everything on the top starts accumulating. So you start getting a ton of this because you're not having the other ingredients so that you can go down. We're talking about a cake. You could have 15 pounds of flour, but if you only have one egg, you can only do enough flour for one egg, and you're going to get all this flour stuck in the top. And the other thing that you're going to get if you have a deficiency at a certain moment in the cycle is that lower down, so the metabolites after where you have eggs in this example as a limiting factor, those are going to start being very, very, very low. And that makes a lot of sense when you see it in the context of metabolism. Then you start understanding, oh, that's why I have really low some things and really high some others. I've had, in our case, one of the things that we had crazy high was vitamin B12. And it was a really big surprise when my doctor said, oh, you need methylcobalamin, so B12 shots. And I was like, what's going on? Because, I have this really high level here and I have, why do you tell me that I need more? It's because of that cofactor. And once that cofactor comes in, then you have extra eggs, and all of a sudden, all this flour can be used, and all these cookies are starting to be downstairs. So through the cycle. So I think once we start understanding that, and we're going to understand a lot more of this next week when Susan is explaining the endogenous oxalate piece. And you have to remember endogenous, endo means inside. So that's nothing that you're eating. It's something that your body is producing. And I can actually just share, Susan is going to do a much better job of this, but something like this is going to happen. So this is part of that big cycle. And if you don't have enough B6, so if B6 is in that past example, if B6 is your eggs and you only have one, well, then what happens is that instead of your system going this way, if you don't have enough here, B6, then you cannot make enough of this enzyme, which means that you cannot make enough of this and you cannot go this way. And as anything, the body always has different alternatives. It doesn't have like a one-way street and that's it. If something's stuck, it's going to have to look for alternatives. And so if here it turns out that you don't have B6 to go this way up, you know, to go like left and above, then when it's going to go to the right and to the left. And that's where it's going to be producing oxalate because of that missing B6. So all of this, it's going to be explained much better next week. But just to give you an idea why, when we're talking about oxalate and you are lowering oxalate and you're saying, well, I'm not eating anything and I just took, you know, a test and it's sky high, it might not be because of what you're eating or even what you're dumping. It could be what you're producing because you have a lack of an ingredient. So in our case, when we started, we were in that case, absolutely. And the other thing that we were doing is that we had a lot of problems in our gut. So when we were doing my girls' stool analysis, what came out was a zoo. And it was a zoo with all of the nasty critters. I mean, it was like everything that you shouldn't have was there. You call it, it was there, you know, and that was a really big problem because then the standard of care was giving killing agents. So antifungals, antibacterials, antibiotics of all kinds. And that wasn't helping because they were creating inflammation. They were killing those, but then they were leaving a void that somehow needed to be replaced with something because the body and all of nature hates a vacuum. So what happens is that all of a sudden you have nothing there and you're like, so whatever else is in there that can sprout in those inflammatory circumstances is going to do it. So it was kind of like going back and back and back and just going on a vicious circle. What broke it for us was stopping to think about killing stuff and started working on balancing everything else so that we could get the correct terrain for the correct flora to flourish. So for us, that was exactly what biotin did. So we started doing the high dose biotin. We started high dose biotin when she was 6 years old. And at that moment, our sweet spot was 45 milligrams. So 15 milligrams in the morning, 15 milligrams at midday, and 15 milligrams at night. And that is a huge, huge, huge dose of biotin, especially if you look at just the recommended daily requirement on your vitamin box. And but what happens is that once that wheel started turning, then all of a sudden a lot of different enzymes started to work. There were some that we saw a really big change, which were the carboxylases. And when those started to move up in level and they started to be produced and they were all happy working because we had enough eggs, as in my previous example, then all of a sudden the terrain in my kids' gut started to become better conditions for the good, healthy, normal gut flora or microbiome. And once we had that, her tummy stopped being swollen. She started evacuating with beautiful stools. She started growing. She started absorbing food. She started doing a ton of different things. So in this diet, the adding of certain nutrients is really, really important. It's a very important part of the equation.
I would have to agree with the biotin. You know, my kid looked like a Buddha. And, once we were able to get biotin on board and a sufficient amount of magnesium, and we ramped those up, he was actually up to 60 milligrams at one point. We were able to ramp that back down, but his sweet spot was a lot higher. But once we got there, we literally saw the same thing. The belly flattened out. He was going once or twice a day, good stools, no pain, no constipation. We haven't had constipation in 10 years.
Yeah, no,
he's been regular. As for the right amount, it's going to be very individual. For minerals, we took just the recommended RDA, like for calcium, for his age group, it was close to 1,000 milligrams, and we just split that up between the 3 meals. It was, I think, 400 for magnesium. He takes a little bit more than that now. He tends to need a little bit more magnesium, but we split that up between the 3 meals. Biotin, he's now at 10 milligram maybe.
So it's interesting to hear about all those stories, because I think we need to start realizing that one of the really important things for you to understand, it's the role of the microbiome. And the microbiome, what it does is that it adapts whatever it is that we're eating so that we get the correct forms inside our body. So you could be eating, and I'm just going to say whatever, you could be eating soup today, and you could be eating pizza tomorrow, and you could be eating tacos on Wednesday, and you could be eating all different, different things, but the nutrients that your body needs on a daily basis are the same. Those don't change. And what happens is that it's that gut flora that is going to be adapting, whatever it is that you're eating, and breaking it up so that what goes inside is correct. And if you have a lot of inflammation, if you have a very bad terrain in your gut, that creates the need for repair mechanisms. And those repair mechanisms are sometimes those which we call the bad gut bugs. And that whole scenario, for me, it's very, very clear because of something completely different. I'm a gardener. I am a permaculturist. I'm a certified permaculturist. And I do a lot with the creation of little ecosystems. So that whole scenario where there's very different players working together towards that one same result, it's we see it in the garden. So when you see something that you would call a weed, like nettles or something like that, it's not that they are bad and you have to pull them or spray them or kill them. You have to understand why they're there. In the case of nettles, their roots look like nets. And so if you have nettles, it's because you have a very high risk of erosion. And so that root system is just kind of like holding all of the ground as fast as possible so that the next rain comes and it doesn't wash everything away. But if you compact that soil, if you plant so that you have other root systems helping out in there, it's incredible, but the nettles are going to go on their own because they're no longer needed. If you see it at a much different example or extreme example, you've seen, probably everybody has seen on the news, whenever it rains in the desert, the beautiful flowers that are all over. I don't know if you guys have seen that. And you say, where were they? They were always there, but they were just waiting for the right germination conditions. It's exactly the same thing with your gut flora. So everything is potentially there. We just need to make the right conditions so that the good ones come out, the ones that gives us health and that gives us all those processes so that things can be absorbed correctly.
And I'd like to surf that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Karla, before I
was just going to say everything's in balance. You know, people, you think about E. coli. You know, a small amount in your gut is actually beneficial. You know, you don't want an E. coli overgrowth, but, you know, even yeast, you know, it serves a function. You don't want an overgrowth. You want everything in balance.
Exactly. Clostridia, some of them, yes, you want them in there, but not too much. So everything is balanced.
And so this is one of the places where some people can get really confused, because they'll say, well, if I had a healthy gut, I wouldn't have an oxalate problem. But oxalate is an independent factor in the balance in your gut as well. So I've had clients who have had really high levels of like candida as an example, and you start to bring oxalate down and candida starts to fall back. And in my own case, I had really high levels of candida. I was one of those people who took really high doses of biotin to knock it out. And once that had happened, in my 50s, I had to have a couple of wisdom teeth taken out that had never been removed before, because they were found to have infection that was starting to develop underneath and behind them. And I was not a happy camper, because I thought, then I'm going to mess myself up. I'm going to have candida again, because before that, every time I'd taken antibiotics, I'd had a candida infection of one kind or another. I got those out. I took the antibiotics because I had to make sure that the infection in behind them was dealt with. And I never got a candida infection because my gut wasn't unbalanced by all the oxalate. I'd been low oxalate for 3 or 4 years at that point. I came through it with flying colors. So I know we're supposed to be talking about nutrients and how to implement the nutrients, but you can see how this is kind of a nuanced process where it really isn't one size fits all, because your gut may not be in the same shape as somebody else. And how much you need is going to depend on what kinds of stressors your body's dealt with and what kinds of conditions, what kinds of healing your body's trying to do. And, you know, that's where in our case, we did ultimately implement B vitamins. But because we had done so much with Epsom salts and minerals and stuff like that to start out with, by the time we came in with a kind of a low dose B complex, which I opened up and then put into my kids' smoothies so that they would get it that way, we were all fine, because we weren't short eggs, to use Patricia's example. You know, we had more than enough eggs to handle once things were starting to move. And you know, we had dealt with kind of this really basic insufficiency that oxalate is very prone to do, because if you're taking in any kind of soluble oxalate, that's making its way into your bloodstream, and then that is binding with minerals. And then when the kidneys do their job with this oxalate molecule and sweep it out, it's taking the mineral with it. And so even if you don't have a blood test which shows that you're low in magnesium or whatever, the challenge is that you could be insufficient, particularly down at the tissue level. So we also have to keep in mind when it comes to tests, because somebody had asked about tests, the challenge here is that your body will protect the values in your bloodstream at all costs for urgent function. But that doesn't mean that there isn't somebody in the process being shorted a little bit, maybe even persistently over time. And that's where the difficulty can come in, because then we go, oh, I've got an oxalate issue, so I'm going to start these big doses of biotin, like all of us here did at one point or another, or B6 or B1. And then somewhere in your system, on some crucial pathway that where a process is going to get handed along, maybe there's just not enough minerals for something like that to happen. So really, for people who are struggling to try and get a supplement started, definitely look at your cofactors. I can't even imagine, at one point I was on 80 milligrams of biotin a day. I cannot imagine how I would have handled that in any way, shape, or form without this persistent support that I'd done for a long time before I ever tried to get on biotin at all, with minerals. And I was one of those people who, Epsom salts baths worked like magic. So I had been, supporting my body's magnesium levels a lot, because that was also another thing that we took just to make sure that the bowels moved regularly. So for me, I was taking lots of magnesium, because that was not only something that I needed to absorb, but it was something that helped with bowel movements. And so I kind of did it that way. So we're really saying that this is a nuanced dance. You're certainly not going to be able to come out of the gate and go, okay, I need to be taking lots of magnesium. I need to be taking lots of B6. Let's just go. You have to see how your body handles it, because I've even heard stories from people on the Trying Low Oxalates group where if they were fine if they took maybe calcium but not magnesium, or they were fine if they took magnesium but not calcium, the minerals seem to start dumping up. So you really have to kind of nuance your way through this. So it's not so much a decision tree, well, if this, then this. For those of you who are programming heads, I was in the IT world before I started this. So, I was kind of looking for a decision tree. It's more like a grid and a matrix. And so you're working your way on a non-linear path through this thing, because everything touches everything else in the body. We might think about it in isolated systems, but that's not how the body works. So we have to keep that in mind.
Probiotics.
I was good. Yeah, exactly.
That's one thing we haven't really talked too much about, but that was another key piece of the puzzle. But we used to use VSL3.
Me too.
They've changed the formulation, and it tends to be problematic for some. So we switched to a custom probiotics, which has a similar formula. The big issue with probiotics for us was, again, slow. If you
that's where I got my butt kicked.
Yes.
I got my butt kicked on that. This is part of the reason that I stayed with minerals and kind of did that first, because the first time I took, my kids did fine with VSL3, but the first time I took VSL3, I thought, oh, I'll split this between the three of us. The two little ones, right? Fine. Me, out for 5 days. I was flattened by that thing. So, there can be, this is another one of those things. That's why we always say with anything, start low and slow. Anyhow, back to the probiotic discussion.
Yes, we did. We used baby scoops, for Ian, and then it was like a toothpick, because he had, initially, just like he had with magnesium when we did the Epsom salt baths and he went berserk, and we had something similar with VSL3
with me. It triggered really intense dumping, just really intense dumping. And so I would not recommend, even with probiotics, folks, just think low and slow. If it's in a capsule, open the capsule, put a little bit in. I now look at whatever the dose is of a low dose something. I always start with a low dose something. And then I have a little shot glass where all my open capsules are in my kitchen. And I'm pointing over this way because that's where my kitchen is. And, you know, sometimes my husband doesn't like it, but really, sometimes you have to spend a whole week or more doing that one little capsule, or you're not going to do okay.
Yep.
And that's another really good point. So I think you've heard 3 testimonials that are wildly different. And but I think everybody needs kind of like the same makeup or something that you could use, because I think right now a lot of people might be saying, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. What's next? So I think if we're talking about basic supplementation, you need to start thinking about the minerals, especially if you haven't been taking them. You need to be maybe looking at a probiotic, and you need to be looking at the B vitamins.
Those are your foundational things, right? Like, and I actually think of minerals as being the first foundational piece, and then possibly the probiotics. I don't know how you guys feel, but maybe the probiotics and then the Bs, or would you go Bs after you do this foundational mineral stuff? I
would do Bs, but it's just because Bs were such a strong thing for us. But
yeah.
The other thing that it's really important, and we've been saying it, or at least I've been trying to say it every single time, is that you want to maintain balance. So exactly as in my gardening example, you do not go from drought to drowning it in water. You know, even though it needs water, you cannot swamp it. So you need to start, you know, moistening a little bit the soil, let it become a little bit more crumbly and absorbing, and then you can start watering it a little bit more. In that same way, you need to start adding all of your supplements and minerals and probiotics and whatever's in a very low and slow fashion. And Susan usually taught me from the beginning, especially with the bees, you start with 1/5 of your target dose and you start working your way up slowly. So it's really really important. And normally, if you see the way the cycle works that we've been talking about, then the order of those bees, just following, you know, the enzymes that you need in the cycle, would be like biotin, thiamine, and then B6, and start. So get your biotin established. Just go maybe to 2/5 of your target dose, and then start the thiamine. 2/5 of your target dose, and then start the B6, and then you start moving that wheel slowly, adding those small steps and putting those eggs where they need to be, so that everything starts creaking and moving in the correct way again.
And if you have the opportunity, log.
Oh yeah, log
what you're seeing. That was for Ian. Probably the most helpful thing was starting to supplement, waiting a couple of days, and logging reactions, because there will be some things that you get an instantaneous reaction, like when we added benfotiamine, he was dumping within hours. There were other things that took, you know, a week before things kicked in. So, you know, low and slow is exactly that. You know, start it, give yourself a couple of days, a week, to see how things are going before you increase a dose or before you add something in. Because if you haven't seen anything, you know, typically in 2 weeks, then it's not a problem. Typically, folic acid was another one. When we started, you know, we took the The synthetic folic acid made my kid absolutely nutty. Took us forever to figure that out because it was in the B complex that we gave him. So we had to throw the B complex out and then start stuff one at a time. And then we figured out, hey, folinic works really good for him. And methylfolate works even better. But, you know, the regular folic acid, no, not so good.
And not everything is going to go as slowly. So we always recommend start low and slow. But, you know, I found that certain things didn't work well for me either. And I had to back up and start over again or whatever. But I remember starting the biotin and just sort of zoom and away I went. But so we're not saying that every time you're going to have to crawl through implementing a supplement. To some degree, as you build this foundation and you've got this solid platform that you're on, and you have more of your basic nutrition covered well, you may find that you can implement the next one easily. Like I remember going to benfotiamine myself. Like I was able to rev it up really quickly. Now, we've got a question about what's your target dose. You know, this is so unique. But what I'd say is, in my case, I will start at a low dose. I'll keep going until I see something positive, unless I see something positive out of the gate. When I see something positive, I'll hold still there for a while and see if it's my sweet spot. What you're looking for is your sweet spot. It's a little bit easier if you start out and you don't see anything. Okay, then I'm going to put my dose up, and then I'm going to put it up. And then, like, at some point, if you're not seeing anything, maybe it's not for you. And if you're seeing anything negative, maybe you have to come back from it. It's this dance among the kinds of things that you're seeing with a supplement. And what qualifies as something positive? Well, more energy, less symptoms. Like that's going to be, again, somewhat unique as to what people see that's positive. Better sleep or not needing as much sleep. Like it could be all kinds of things, but it's positive for you. What you're looking for is your sweet spot. And that's, you know, to get more detailed about that, you really have to work with somebody who can kind of monitor, take the feedback that you can provide them and say, oh, I know what that means, go this way, or I know what that means, go that way, right? Because it really is a lot of also learning what works best for you. So I've had supplements I took that were a meh, I didn't really notice anything, so I stopped taking them. I've had other ones that were, I saw something a little bit better. My energy came up a little bit. I was getting better sleep, whatever. And so I went another level and another level. I mean, that's how I got to 80 milligrams on biotin. I just kept seeing good things. And then you might want to think about an exit strategy. If you've been doing something for a long time, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it forever. So I got up to 80 milligrams of biotin and I was taking it consistently. And I did that for about, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 weeks, something like that. It was not very long. And then I would take the last dose that I had in my day and I'd go, I don't feel so good after that one. And so I started to rev it down. So I made slightly smaller doses and still took my 4 across the day. And then it was like, okay, so that feels better. And then I got to the point again where the last dose of the day didn't feel good. You know, so you're really looking for what you know to be your kind of operating parameters as part of this process. And, you know, unless you've got a practitioner who can, you know, order all kinds of tests for you and keep following those tests for you, where, you know, perhaps you're having your mineral levels tracked, perhaps you're having your B vitamins tracked. And I'm talking just about serum, like blood tests at this point. And I don't know which of those tests is best, but what I would say is if you're doing a test and you're doing it regularly, then you've got something to track with. So some of this is, you know, just being able to set a stake in the ground and then see what happens as you make changes. And we're on what I sometimes refer to as the bleeding edge on some of this stuff, because we are, yes, there's science to back us, and yes, there's research to back us on some things, but in other cases, we are still connecting the dots between different pieces of research, and then, trying to build bridges between them, and then look at that in terms of what's the practicality of rubber meets the road. So that is all stuff you have to work out, certainly with your doctor, who can do, order the kinds of tests that will help you to track a lot of this stuff too.
One of the things that I can say personally for biotin for my kid, we had a sac cerveza infection. So candida was not a real big problem for Ian. He had a brewer's yeast infection, and it was pretty systemic. And the kid was literally drunk from that infection. He had the giggles, he had the spins, he had slurred speech, and when he would leave the bathroom, it smelled like there was a bad frat party and they had drunk, a couple of kegs of skunky beer. It literally smelled like someone had, thrown a keg party in there. And as we ramped up the biotin, that was less and less of an issue. I mean, he still had it initially, but it continued to improve. And, we had done stool tests, and I can remember telling the doctor, I don't know what's up with this kid. He's got the spins and giggles, he's acting like he's drunk, and the bathroom smells like a kegger gone bad. And, he looked at the stool test results and went, well, yeah, that's kind of because he is. And, he's like, your kid has a sac cerveza infection, he's basically getting drunk off a brewer's yeast. But as we continued with the biotin, we did the stool tests, and you could see it go from pathogenic slowly to benign, or what they would call neutral. And it never became part of the beneficial flora, but it eventually went away. So that was a huge, that's for us, that's all we needed to see, was that, he needed the biotin, and the biotin helped balance stuff out.
I think one of the things that happened in the chat now that I think it's really important to say it also one with the voice is where do you start? So it sounds so a little bit scary. How do I know how high to go in biotin? How high do I need to go there? How, what's the where do I start, and which supplements we need to start? And of course, this is the discussion that you need to take to your doctor, to your nutritionist, or to your healthcare professional that knows a little bit about metabolism. Functional medicine doctor might be a good first, choice. And as a first target, the RDA, the recommended daily allowance, might be a good target. And if you test in any way as having a deficiency, then you can go a little bit above the RDA, because then you are going to be using your daily allowance for your daily metabolic needs, but then you will be adding a little bit extra to start filling up that gap. So that might be a very safe and a very logical way to go about it. So we know that oxalate makes minerals go away. So because it's a highly reactive molecule, you have a preferred dance partner, so you're probably losing minerals with it. So you can be pretty sure if you have an oxalate problem, if you've tested or you're in this group because you think you're having an oxalate problem, you probably are going to want to have some minerals in your plan. And then on the B vitamins, start with the RDA and just go a little bit up. And when we're talking about that sweet spot, you will start to feel the difference. And that's why logging is so important. I'm just repeating what's been said, but I think sometimes it's easy when everything just kind of like condensed into just one phrase. So start writing down how you feel. And you're going to start seeing that because oxalate is such an inflammatory agent, so it causes a lot of inflammation. You know, it activates inflammation. We talked about all of these things. And because that inflammation is going to be located in places where maybe you were injured before, this is very, very personal. So a lot of my pain responses from oxalate are in a place where I broke my foot. And, you know, if I say, well, everybody, you know, if you have pain in your foot, then you have an oxalate problem. That's not necessarily true for anybody else but me. So,
yeah, I cracked my tailbone figure skating when I was a kid. So I'll get these intensive pains, not anymore, thankfully, but I would get these intensive pains when I was oxalate dumping. So when that would crop up, I'd go, oh yeah, whatever I last took may have stimulated some. I might even back down a little on my supplements when that happened and then go back up again, like just to give my body a bit of a break. So yeah, the right dose is tough. For sure, if you are not working with an oxalate literate practitioner, if you're working with your family doctor who really doesn't get it or somebody like that, then absolutely go to just the RDA to start. Like, so if you're kind of working on your own a little bit here, folks, like go really careful. You know, we know because we were doing it on our own kind of, and with Susan Owens' support and the Triangle Oxalate support group. But, you know, we're really doing something which is not really recognized yet. Like the world still thinks unless you got a kidney stone, it can't be oxalate, right?
We found our information through an autism conference because oxalate tends to be a not uncommon issue with kids on the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of practitioners that are at least mildly familiar.
If they're Dan trained, that's how we ended up with somebody who was oxalate literate, at least, like not completely, but at least enough to be able to help us with our journey to some degree. He was a functional medicine, naturopathic doctor. So to Patricia's point, functional med people may be helpful here. But he had been Dan trained, and Dan exclamation mark DAN exclamation mark is defeat autism now. And those folks, there may be people from there who understand, but you know, you can always cross-check with your own symptoms, cross-check with, you know, other good sources of oxalate information. We're one of those.
And, hang on, let me see.
There is a question about pregnancy. Could pregnancy lead to endogenous oxalate production due to mineral and vitamin depletion? I do not know the answer to that. I don't know if you two ladies know.
Mm-mm.
No, offhand, that's not one that I think I've followed up with at all, but you know, I don't know about you folks, but when I was pregnant and before I knew about oxalate, I actually felt better when I was pregnant. So don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't have an answer, to tell you the truth. I don't know. I probably did have an oxalate issue when I was pregnant because I was a spinach buff, and probably did. But I have no idea if that was part of everything else that followed. So I'm sorry.
Well, and the thing is,
I'll probably
endogenous
ask
production
for next time.
Yeah, and endogenous production is really like it's not the more common thing, I'm thinking, in terms of, well, I can't even say that. Let's not say that. Well, let's wait until we have our conversation with Susan Owens when she's going to talk about endogenous production, because this is, I don't, you know, this is kind of a question as to how much risk there is involved there. I'm sort of assuming, but I had 2 pregnancies before I knew about oxalate. And I, you know, by the time I found the diet, I was 48. I had a almost 3-year-old. I had an 8-year-old, and I've never shown signs of being endogenous producer. And once I got my oxalate lowered and I made my way through, you know, oxalate dumping, I was doing fine. And, you know, me and my supplements, and I was fine. So I'm not sure that I'd assume that. And gosh, I was 40 by the time I had my first kid. So if anybody should have been teed up for endogenous production, I should have been, but doesn't appear to be what happened.
Well, I hope this has been helpful. I know supplementing can be very, very confusing. These are testimonials, so please go check with a doctor or somebody who knows about your specific health story and history. And we hope you found this helpful. Next week, normally at this time, we will have Susan Owens explaining endogenous oxalate in much better detail than I have. And we will see you there. As always, this recording will be available on our YouTube channel, which is Wizards of Ox, OX. And if you can help us with liking it and hitting the little bell so that you get notified every time we post something, we would really appreciate it. And we will see you then next week, and have a lovely time. Bye-bye.